She survived the mountain. What she didn't survive was her family. A blizzard, a crippled leg, and the moment she realized the footprints in the snow ahead of her weren't slowing down, they were speeding up. Her own blood had made a decision about her life without asking her permission. Alara Vance was 23 years old, alone on a mountain that wanted to kill her, and the people who were supposed to love her had just decided to let it. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay until the end. You won't regret it. The cold came in layers. That was the thing nobody told you about mountain cold. It didn't hit you all at once like a wall. It crept. First it took your fingers, made them clumsy and slow, turned them into thick, useless things you kept staring at because they looked like your fingers but couldn't do what fingers were supposed to do. Then it climbed your wrists, your forearms, moved up toward your elbows like something patient and deliberate. Then it got inside your chest and sat there, heavy and wet, making every breath feel like you were inhaling gravel. Alara Vance had been cold before. Poor cold, hungry cold. The kind of cold that comes from a house with bad insulation and a father who drank the firewood money. She knew cold. But this was different. This cold had intention. She'd been walking, limping, really, dragging her right leg through snow that came up past her knee, for what she estimated was 3 hours, though time had stopped meaning much about an hour back. The blizzard had swallowed the trail somewhere behind her, and the tracks she was following, the tracks that were supposed to be her family's tracks, had become harder and harder to find. The wind kept filling them in. The snow kept falling sideways, thick and wet and relentless, sticking to her eyelashes, finding the gap at her collar, working its way down her back like cold fingers. She stopped. She bent forward, hands on her knees, and breathed through her mouth because her nose had stopped working sometime in the last hour. They're ahead, she told herself. They're just moving faster, that's all. But even as she thought it, something cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in her gut, because she had been telling herself that for 3 hours. They're just ahead, just around the next ridge, just past the tree line. And every time she reached the next ridge, the next tree line, the next landmark she'd been using to measure distance, there was nothing. Just more mountain, more snow, more silence that the blizzard kept filling with noise that somehow made everything lonelier. Her right leg throbbed. She'd broken it 8 months ago. Well, broken was what her mother had called it, though the break had healed badly and left her with a leg that didn't quite bend right, a knee that swelled when it rained or when she pushed it too hard. The mountain crossing had been pushing it hard for 4 days straight. By the second morning, she'd already been falling behind. By the third, her mother had stopped waiting at the rest points. You need to keep pace, her brother Marcus had told her, not unkindly, though the words were unkind. We can't wait every time you need to stop. I'm not asking you to wait every time, she'd said, just sometimes. He'd looked at her with an expression she hadn't been able to read at the time. Now, alone on the mountain with the blizzard closing in and the tracks disappearing under fresh snow, she thought maybe she could read it. It was the expression of a man who had already made a decision, who was just waiting for the right moment to act on it. She straightened up and kept moving. The right thing, the rational thing, the thing any reasonable person would do, was to turn around, go back down the mountain. The crossing was supposed to take 5 days. They were on day 4. She'd been following the tracks for 3 hours since losing sight of the others, which meant she was somewhere in the middle of a mountain range she didn't know, in a blizzard that showed no sign of stopping, with a leg that was going to give out inside of another mile. But going back meant going back alone. And the wagon, all their supplies, everything they'd carried across the mountains, was with the family. With Marcus and her mother's new husband, Dale, who had organized the crossing and who had made it very clear from the beginning that he considered Alara a problem that hadn't been adequately planned for. She's going to slow us down, she'd heard him say to her mother on the first night when they thought she was asleep. I told you before we left. A girl with a bad leg on a mountain crossing in winter. That's a liability, not a family member. And her mother had said something too quiet to hear. And Dale had grunted. And that had been that. Alara had told herself it was just Dale talking. Dale was always talking like that, always calculating everything in terms of weight and cost and whether the trade was worth it. That was how he thought. It didn't mean anything, except now she was alone on a mountain and the tracks were gone and there was a small, terrible voice in the back of her head that had stopped whispering and started saying things out loud. They didn't lose you. You didn't fall behind. They decided to walk faster. She shook her head, physically shook it, snow scattering from her hair. That was insane. That was the kind of thing that happened in stories, not in real life, not to real people. Families didn't do that. Even bad families, even families like hers with too many debts, and a stepfather who resented her, and a mother who'd stopped fighting for her years ago. They didn't just leave you on a mountain. Her leg buckled. She caught herself on a tree trunk, fingers scraping bark, and stood there for a moment with her forehead against the rough wood, breathing hard. The leg wasn't going to last much longer. She knew that the way she knew things about her own body now, the particular quality of the pain had changed, gone from the deep ache of overuse to something sharper, more specific, a grinding sensation in her knee that made her vision blur when she put her full weight on it. Keep moving, she told herself. Keep moving or you'll stiffen up and you won't move at all. She pushed off the tree trunk and kept moving. The next 30 minutes were the worst of her life up to that point, though she didn't know yet that they were only the second worst. That worse was waiting ahead of her in about 20 minutes, when the last traces of the tracks finally disappeared and left her standing in an expanse of white, with no direction, no landmark, nothing but snow and wind, and the growing dark of a mountain afternoon turning toward evening. She stood there for a long moment. She turned in a slow circle, squinting against the wind. North. Or what she thought was north. The trail had been running mostly north, angling toward a pass that Dale had marked on his map. If she kept going north, she might hit the pass. If she hit the pass, there might be shelter. An old trapper's hut, Dale had mentioned something about a trapper's hut near the pass, though he'd been vague about whether it was still standing, whether it was stocked with anything. She went north. She went north for what felt like another hour, though it might have been 30 minutes or 2 hours. Time had completely untethered from anything measurable. The light had dropped from the flat gray of afternoon to the deeper gray of early evening. The temperature, already brutal, was dropping with it. Her leg was a specific and constant agony now. Her feet, she couldn't feel her feet. She kept looking down at them to confirm they were still moving, which was the only way she knew they were. And then she found the stone. It was a flat stone about the size of a dinner plate, sitting slightly off the ground where it had been propped against a snowdrift. There was something beneath it. She almost walked past it, but something made her stop. Something about the way it sat, slightly too deliberate, slightly too placed. She bent down, her knee screaming, and lifted the stone. Beneath it was a piece of oilcloth, folded over itself and tied with a cord. Inside the oilcloth was a piece of paper. She unfolded it. Her mother's handwriting. She recognized it immediately. The round, slightly backward slant her mother had never bothered to correct, the way she wrote her E's with an extra loop. Elara. We cannot wait. Dale says we will not make the pass if we stop, and he is right. You are strong. You will find a way. God keep you safe. Mama. She read it twice. She read it a third time. You are strong. You will find a way. Not, we will come back for you. Not, wait here and we will send help. Not even the simple human, we are sorry. Just, you are strong. You will find a way. The oilcloth fell from her fingers. The paper, already wet from the snow, began to dissolve at the edges. She watched it for a moment with a strange, disconnected feeling, like she was watching something happen to someone else from a great distance. They had known. They hadn't gotten separated from her, hadn't lost her in the blizzard, hadn't assumed she was just behind them. They had stopped to leave her a note, which meant they had made a decision deliberate enough to require a note. They had talked about it, maybe the night before, maybe that morning, maybe for days. And they had decided that Elara was more weight than they could carry, and they had planned for the moment when they would leave her behind. The note was kindness, the cruelest kind. The kind that says, I thought about you before I abandoned you, but kindness nonetheless, of a sort. She should have cried. Later, she would think about that moment and wonder why she hadn't cried. But the cold had gotten into something deeper than muscle by then, had gotten into some emotional mechanism, and what she felt instead of grief was a strange, blazing clarity, like the snow had burned everything else away and left only the essential question, which was very simple. Was she going to die here or not? She picked up the oilcloth. Habit, you didn't leave materials in the wilderness. And she put the stone back, and she kept moving north. She lasted another 40 minutes. She knew she was in real trouble when she stopped being cold. The cold had been her companion for hours, her miserable constant companion, and when it started to fade, not because she was warming up, but because her body had run out of the ability to register it, that was when she knew. She'd heard about this. People froze and started to feel warm near the end, some trick of the dying body, a kindness the cold offered right before it took everything. She found a tree, a big pine, its lower branches forming a kind of rough shelter where the snow was thinner, and she sat down against it with the intention of resting for 5 minutes. Just 5. Then she'd get up and keep moving. She closed her eyes. She didn't intend to, but the not cold was comfortable, comparatively, and the not feeling was a relief after hours of pain, and her body made a decision without consulting her. She slept, and while she slept, the snow continued to fall. She came back to consciousness because something was hurting her, not the distant, muffled pain of before. Something sharp and immediate, something that grabbed her by the collar of her coat and yanked. She gasped, and the air she inhaled was so cold it felt like swallowing glass. And she started coughing, and while she was coughing, she became aware of 2 things simultaneously. 1, she was moving, being moved. Something had her by the back of her coat and was dragging her through the snow. 2, it was dark. Full dark, mountain dark, the kind of dark that is absolute and complete. She couldn't see anything except the blur of snow still falling, and when she twisted her head to look, a shape behind her. A large shape. Human, she thought, though it was hard to tell. It was bundled in furs, enormous, moving through the snow with the kind of slow, deliberate power that didn't ask permission of the terrain. "Hey!" Her voice came out as a croak. "Hey! Hey! What?" The shape didn't stop, didn't answer, just kept moving, dragging her through the snow at a steady pace. "Stop!" She tried to twist out of the grip. "Stop! Let go!" The grip didn't loosen, not cruelly, but with the absolute firmness of someone who had made a decision and saw no reason to revisit it. "I can walk," she said, though she wasn't sure that was true. The shape stopped. A pause. Then a voice. Low, rough, the kind of voice that came from years of mostly silence broken by necessity rather than choice. "No, you can't." Simple. Matter of fact. Not cruel, just accurate. She stopped fighting. They went through the dark for what felt like a long time. The shape, man, she decided, that was definitely a man's voice, navigated the mountain with a confidence that suggested he knew it the way she knew the layout of rooms she'd lived in for years, not by thinking, but by memory in the body. He didn't hesitate, didn't slow down, except once, when she managed to get her feet under her enough to take some of her own weight, and he adjusted without comment. She couldn't see where they were going. She could only see the snow and the dark, and occasionally the bulk of him ahead of her. She should have been terrified. She was alone on a mountain, injured, being dragged somewhere by a stranger who hadn't introduced himself or offered reassurance or done any of the things people were supposed to do in this situation. But the truth was, she was too tired to be terrified. She had used all of it up. And besides, if he wanted to hurt her, he could have done that already. The cabin appeared out of the dark like something she might have hallucinated. It was small. She could see that even in the dark. A low structure, log walls, a single window with light leaking around its shutters. A stovepipe. A woodpile stacked with obvious care along one wall. A door, heavy and solid, that the man pushed open with his shoulder because his hands were occupied with her. The inside hit her like a wall. Heat. Actual heat, radiating from an iron stove in the corner that was glowing orange at its joints. The smell of wood smoke and something else. Animal, leather, pine. The light was dim, a single lantern on a table, but after the darkness outside it seemed brilliant. The man dropped her, not unkindly but without ceremony, onto a low cot near the stove. She hit the thin mattress and lay there for a moment, blinking up at the ceiling, which was rough-hewn logs with the bark still on them, strung with dried things she couldn't identify in the low light. Herbs, maybe. Traps. Strips of something dark. She turned her head and looked at the man for the first time. He was big. She'd registered that in the dark, but the cabin confirmed it. He had to turn sideways slightly to move between the table and the wall, and the ceiling came close enough to his head that he seemed instinctively to dip his chin when he moved. He was somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, she thought, though it was hard to tell with the face he had. Weathered and scarred, not handsome, not ugly, just the face of someone who'd spent a long time outdoors and in situations that left marks. A beard, dark, going gray, thick and practical rather than decorative. Eyes she couldn't quite get the color of in the lantern light, but which were watching her with a directness that was unsettling. He was pulling off his outer layers, furs and oilskin, layer after layer, with the efficiency of someone who did this every day and had stopped thinking about the individual steps. Underneath was a heavy wool shirt, worn through at the elbows, and canvas trousers tucked into boot tops. He hung his things on pegs by the door, and then he turned and looked at her, and he said, "Boots." She blinked. "What?" "Take your boots off." He crossed to the stove, lifted the lid, fed in another piece of wood from a box nearby. "Frostbite. Need to see your feet." "I'm fine." He turned and looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite patience and wasn't quite impatience. "You were frozen when I found you. You haven't been able to feel your feet for how long?" She thought about it. "Maybe 2 hours? Then you're not fine." He pulled a wooden stool from under the table and set it down near the cot and sat on it, and he held out his hand. Not asking, exactly. More like offering a service. She stared at his hand for a moment. Then she sat up. Her head spun with the change in position, and she reached down and started unlacing her left boot. Her fingers weren't working properly. She got the knot partially undone before her hand started shaking too badly to continue. She pressed her fingers against her thighs and tried to breathe. "Here." He leaned forward and took over. He unlaced her boots with quick, practiced efficiency, and he pulled them off, and then he pulled off her socks, and he held her feet in his hands. Just held them, his hands surprisingly warm against her skin. And he looked at her toes. She looked too. They were white and waxy looking, like someone else's toes attached to the wrong body. "Can you feel that?" He pressed his thumb against her big toe. "No." He made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. He let go of her feet and stood up and crossed to the stove, and he came back with a basin of water. Not hot, she noticed, lukewarm. And he set it on the floor in front of her and gestured for her to put her feet in. "Not hot water," he said, before she could ask. "Hurts worse, and you can burn yourself without knowing." She put her feet in the lukewarm water, sat there. The water made no impression on her feet for a long moment, and then, gradually, with a horrible tingling that built and built until it was genuinely painful, sensation started to return. She bit down on the inside of her cheek and didn't make a sound. He watched her face while this happened, not with warmth, but with attention, the way someone watches something to see if it's going to be okay. "You've done this before," she said, because it was better than sitting in silence while her feet woke up. "Yes." "Who are you?" A pause. He seemed to consider whether this question required answering, and apparently concluded that it did, minimally. "Silas Crow. Alara Vance." He acknowledged this with nothing. Not a nod, not an acknowledgement. He just went back to watching her feet. "Thank you," she said, for finding me. "Saw your tracks before the storm covered them." A pause. "Another hour and I wouldn't have." She thought about that. Another hour. She'd been asleep under that tree for less than an hour, and it had almost been enough. It was a strange number to sit with. 1 hour between being alive and being found frozen in the spring thaw. If he'd gone out an hour later or an hour earlier and taken a different route, or if the storm had come down harder and covered her tracks faster. "Why were you out in that?" she said. "In the blizzard?" "Checking traps." Said as though it were obvious, as though people did this. "In a blizzard. Traps don't check themselves." She looked at him. He had moved to the table now, doing something with a piece of leather and a tool she couldn't identify. He wasn't looking at her. "Are you a trapper?" "Yes." "Is this your cabin?" "Yes." She was getting the rhythm of him. He answered direct questions with direct answers, minimum words, no elaboration. He wasn't rude, exactly. More like someone who had edited his speech down to only what was necessary and saw no reason to add back the social filler that most people use to make conversations feel comfortable. Her feet were beginning to hurt seriously now, which her cold, addled brain slowly recognized as a good sign. Pain meant blood flow. Blood flow meant the tissue was alive. She was going to have a bad night, but she wasn't going to lose any toes. She looked around the cabin while she could. It was a single room, maybe 12 feet by 16. The cot she was sitting on, a table with 2 chairs, the iron stove, larger than it had looked from outside, shelves along 2 walls crowded with things, canned goods, tools, bundled herbs, coiled rope, traps stacked in careful order. Pegs along the wall near the door holding his outer clothes, and she noticed several other coats and jackets, different weights. A gun rack with 2 rifles and a shotgun, all of them clean, the kind of clean that required ongoing attention. The floor was packed dirt, not wood, but covered in places with fur pelts, not decoratively, but practically, laid wherever the cold would come up through the ground. The ceiling was lower than it had seemed from outside, which made the room feel tight, though she thought with more people in it, it would have felt suffocating. It was not a comfortable space. It was a functional one. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. He looked up from the leatherwork. 6 years. "Alone?" A different kind of pause this time. "Yes." Something in the word told her not to follow that particular thread. She let it go. "The people I was traveling with," she said, and her voice came out more level than she expected. "They went on without me. If you found my tracks, were there other tracks? A group?" He set down the leatherwork and looked at her. Direct, those eyes. She could see them better now in the lantern light. Dark, some shade between brown and green, set deep under heavy brows. No other tracks in that area. Storm would have covered them. "They passed through earlier," she said. "This afternoon, maybe, I don't know, maybe 4, 5 hours before you found me." He said nothing to this, just looked at her. "They left me a note," she said, because she didn't know why, except that it felt important to say it out loud, to make it real, to confirm to herself that she wasn't imagining it. "Under a stone. My mother wrote it." Silence. "They decided I was too slow." She said it flat, factual. "My leg. I broke it. It didn't heal right. I can't move fast enough on mountain terrain. They decided that was a problem they couldn't carry." The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the blizzard was still going, a low constant pressure against the walls. Silas Crow looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then he said simply, "That's their burden to carry." She stared at him. It wasn't what she'd expected. She'd expected either sympathy or none, either "I'm sorry" or silence. She hadn't expected that. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "What they did." He picked up the leatherwork again. "That's something a person has to live with. That's theirs." She thought about that. That's theirs. Not, "How terrible." Not, "You must be devastated." Just the simple observation that the act belonged to the people who committed it, that it was their weight to carry, not hers. It was, she thought, possibly the strangest comfort anyone had ever accidentally offered her. He gave her soup. Boiled from dried meat and root vegetables, he seemed to have an ongoing pot of on the back of the stove. She couldn't tell if it was fresh or had been simmering for days. And she didn't ask, because it was hot and it was food, and her body wanted both more than she'd ever wanted anything. She ate 2 bowls. She could feel her stomach pushing back at the second. It had been too long since she'd had a proper meal, and it had shrunk accordingly. But she got it down anyway, knowing she needed the fuel. Silas ate 1 bowl, standing at the table reading something by the lantern. A notebook of some kind, well worn. When she finished, she set the bowl on the floor and said, "What happens now?" He looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she gestured at the cabin, at the storm outside, at the general situation. "I'm here. The mountain is closed. What's the arrangement?" Something moved across his face. Not quite irritation, more like he was deciding how direct to be. He set the notebook down. "You're here for the winter," he said. "Storm like this comes down. It doesn't let up for days, sometimes weeks. And after this one, there'll be another. It's November. The passes don't clear until March at the earliest." "March." She repeated the word slowly. Could be April. He said it without apparent awareness of what he was asking her to absorb. The crossing your people were making. They'll have made it if they moved fast. You won't. She knew he was right. She knew it logically, understood it the way she understood all the implications of what had happened. Understood it and could not yet feel it, because feeling it required processing it, and she hadn't had time for that yet. I can work, she said. He looked at her. I can cook, I can clean, I can do whatever needs doing. I'm not asking for charity. She held his gaze. Her leg was throbbing, her feet were on fire with returning circulation. She was pretty sure she'd develop bruises from head to foot tomorrow, but she held his gaze because this part mattered. I pay what I owe. He studied her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, but something like recalibration. You'll need to rest a few days first, he said. Your leg. I know. After that. Another pause. He seemed to be thinking about something, working through a problem methodically the way she'd noticed he did things, without rushing. I go out every day weather allows, he said finally. Trapping, hunting. I'm gone sometimes half a day, sometimes all day. When I'm out, the cabin needs to be kept. Fire needs to stay fed. I set the traps in order. The pelts need curing after I bring them in. I can teach you what needs teaching. Okay, I won't go easy on you. He said it without apology. The work needs to get done or we run short on supplies, and running short on supplies in winter up here isn't an inconvenience, it's life and death. I understand that. And if you make a mistake, waste food, let the fire go out, damage a pelt, I'll tell you. He looked at her steadily. I won't be cruel about it, but I'll tell you. That's fair, she said, something that might, in different light, have been a very small and brief thing like respect crossed his face. He picked up the notebook again. Cot's yours, he said. I'll sleep on the floor. You don't have to. I've slept on worse. He was already moving, pulling a heavy blanket from a chest against the wall, spreading it on the fur-covered floor near the stove. She watched him do this with the same economy of motion he did everything else. No fuss, no resentment. Just a problem, sleeping arrangement, and the most straightforward solution. She lay down on the cot. The mattress was thin, and the blanket he'd left her smelled like wood smoke and animal, and the sounds of the storm against the walls were loud and constant. Her leg ached deeply. Her feet were prickling. She was in a stranger's cabin on a mountain that had tried to kill her, put here by a family that had chosen to let it. She stared at the ceiling. The dried things hanging from the rafters moved slightly in the heat rising from the stove. She wasn't going to cry. She decided that deliberately and found, to her own surprise, that she could hold it. Maybe later. Maybe when she was alone, or when the full weight of it settled in more completely. But not now. Right now she needed to sleep and rest her leg and think clearly about what came next, and crying would interfere with all three. You are strong, her mother had written. You are strong. You will find a way. She lay there in the dark cabin listening to Silas Crow's slow, even breathing from the floor, proof that he'd fallen asleep with the same efficiency he did everything else. And she thought about that phrase. Her mother had written it as comfort, maybe as absolution, a way of believing that leaving her daughter on a mountain wasn't quite the thing it was because the daughter was strong and would find a way. A story you told yourself so you could live with what you'd done. But lying there in the warmth of the stove, feet aching, leg throbbing, belly full for the first time in 2 days, Ilara decided to take the phrase and make it her own. Not her mother's version, not the version that justified abandonment, but a different version, a harder version. You are strong. Be it then. She closed her eyes. She slept. 3 days passed before she could put real weight on her leg. Silas didn't push her before then, but she had the sense, from the way he arranged the cabin to keep everything she might need within arm's reach of the cot, from the way he brought food to her rather than requiring her to come to the table, that he was not being generous so much as practical. An injured person who pushed too hard and made themselves worse was a bigger problem than an injured person who healed correctly. She used the 3 days to watch him. He was up before light every morning. She'd hear him moving before she could see anything, the specific sounds of him putting on his outer layers, stoking the fire, checking things she couldn't identify from the cot. By the time the light through the shutter cracks was gray enough to see by, he was gone. He came back at different times, sometimes by noon, sometimes not until near dark. He brought things with him, pelts sometimes, removed from traps and carried home in a pack. Once, a brace of rabbits. Once, nothing except a cut on his left hand that he wrapped without comment, and which she noticed he kept dry thereafter. In the evenings, he worked. The leather work she'd seen that first night was part of it. Repairing harness, she realized. For the sled and the dogs she hadn't known existed until the second morning, when she'd heard them outside and asked. He also sharpened and maintained his traps, worked on things she couldn't always identify, and sometimes read the worn notebook by the lantern. He said little unless she asked something. Then he answered, minimal but accurate. On the fourth morning, she got up before he left and said, "Tell me what to do today." He turned from the door, looked at her, assessing. She'd gotten used to that look, the way he was always measuring something. "Can you stand all right?" She shifted her weight onto her right leg. It hurt. It was always going to hurt, probably, on some level, for the rest of her life. That was what a badly healed bone and a winter mountain did together. But it was bearable. "Yes. Fire first." He pointed at the stove. "It needs to be kept going all day. There's a specific rhythm to it. I'll show you. You put too much in at once. You waste wood. Too little. It goes out and the cabin temperature drops enough that the water stores can freeze in the walls." Okay. He showed her. He was a good teacher in the same way he was everything else. Efficient, no excess words, but clear and exact. He showed her how to read the fire, how to feed it at the right intervals, what different sounds and colors in the flame meant. He showed her where the water was stored and how to check the levels. He showed her where the food stores were, dry goods on the shelves, frozen meat in a cache outside. He could reach from the cabin's small side door without going into the weather. "Don't take from the cache unless I've told you to," he said. "I keep track of what's there." "I understand." "The soup pot can stay going." He gestured at the back of the stove. "Add water when it gets low. Don't add more meat unless I tell you. I measure what goes in. Because supplies are limited. And because I don't know yet how long you're going to eat from them." He said it without apology. "That changes the math." She nodded. The math. She was part of the math now, an addition to the equation of survival that he was constantly running. She understood that. She was going to have to make herself a positive addition, not a negative one. That first day was hard in the way that was worse than physical difficulty. It was the constant vigilance, the attention required, the impossibility of letting your mind drift without missing something that needed doing. The fire required checking every 40 minutes or so. The soup pot needed watching. When a storm gust came down the chimney and scattered sparks across the floor, she had to move fast to stamp them out before they caught on the furs. She burned her wrist getting the sparks. She said nothing, found a clean rag, wrapped the burn, kept working. When Silas came back that evening and she served him soup, and the burn was visible above the rag's edge, he looked at it and said, "How?" "Sparks came down the chimney. There's burn salve." He got up and found it without being asked. A small tin on the shelf, unlabeled. "Put this on it." "It's fine." "Put it on it anyway." He set the tin on the table in front of her and went back to eating. She put it on. It helped. They'd been in the cabin together for 9 days when they had their first real argument. It was about the wood. She'd been managing the fire correctly. She was certain of it. She'd been careful. She'd been watching it all day. But that evening, Silas looked at the wood pile near the stove and then at the weather and said, "You're burning it too fast." She looked up from the pot she was stirring. "I've been maintaining it how you showed me. The temperature's been dropping. You need to adjust. When it gets colder outside, you have to burn less, not more, because the heat is going to go out faster regardless. You compensate by banking the coals differently." "You didn't tell me that." "No." He said it evenly. "I'm telling you now." "But you're saying I did it wrong when you didn't give me the information to do it right." Something flickered in his expression. "I'm saying we're down on wood, and I need you to understand why, so it doesn't happen again. I'm not blaming you for something I didn't teach you." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "It sounded like you were." A pause. "I wasn't." Another pause. "I'll show you how to bank it correctly tomorrow." She went back to stirring the pot. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. But something shifted. infinitesimally, in the particular texture of the silence they occupied together. Later, when she was almost asleep, she heard him say from the floor quietly, "You're doing well." She didn't respond. She wasn't sure he'd meant for her to hear it. It might have been something he was saying to himself, or to the cabin, or to the situation. The way people sometimes said true things out loud, not because they wanted to be heard, but because the truth needed somewhere to exist outside the head. She lay in the dark and held that sentence very carefully. "You're doing well." She was, she thought. She was doing well. She intended to keep doing it. Outside, the mountain winter deepened. The snow fell and fell and fell, and the cold pressed down like a hand on the roof. And in a cabin barely larger than some people's closets, two people who did not trust each other, who had no particular reason to trust each other, who came from completely different worlds and had been thrown together by nothing more than the direction of a storm and the location of a set of tracks in the snow, began, slowly and without acknowledging it, to learn each other. Not warmly, not easily, not with any of the niceties that usually marked the beginning of human relationships, but thoroughly, in the way that only happens when there is no alternative, when the world outside is white and cold and indifferent, and the only thing between you and it is walls and a fire and each other. Elara Vance had survived her family's betrayal. She intended to survive the winter too. She intended to survive everything that came after that. The wood lesson stuck. After that night, Elara paid attention differently, not just to the tasks themselves, the fire, the soup pot, the pelts Silas began teaching her to cure, but to the reasoning underneath them. Every rule he'd given her had a reason, and the reasons were all the same reason. Waste nothing, because nothing was replaceable up here. Not until spring, and spring was a long way off. She started asking why before she asked how. Silas seemed to prefer it that way, though he never said so. He just answered the why questions with more words than he gave the how questions, which was its own kind of communication. Why do you salt the pelts before you scrape them? Draws the moisture out faster. You scrape first, you're working against yourself. Why do the rabbits hang outside but the larger pelts stay in? Temperature. Rabbit freezes too hard to work. Elk hide is thick enough to take it, actually easier to scrape when it's cold stiff. She cataloged these things. She had always been good at cataloging, at taking information and filing it somewhere useful, at building mental maps of how systems worked. It was one of the things she'd been good at before the bad leg had started to define her, back when she'd had more to work with than her family's diminishing goodwill and a body that kept failing her in specific and inconvenient ways. By the end of the second week, she could manage the fire through a full day without issue. By the end of the third, she'd learned to cure a rabbit pelt from scratch, start to finish, badly, but completely. Silas had examined her work without comment, which she'd learned to interpret as passing grade. When something was actually wrong, he said so. She'd burned the first pelt she tried, held the scraper wrong, pressed too hard, torn through the membrane. You ruined it, Silas had said, looking at the damage. I know. She set the scraper down. Show me again what I did wrong. He had. Without sighing, without the particular weariness of a man who'd expected failure and gotten it. Just showed her. That was the thing she was slowly, reluctantly beginning to acknowledge about Silas Crow. He was fair. Not kind, not warm, not easy, but fair. If something was her fault, he told her plainly. If something wasn't her fault, he didn't pretend it was. It was a mode of interaction she'd had very little experience with, growing up in a household where blame distributed itself according to whoever Dale wanted to avoid looking at, where her mother's approval came and went with her husband's moods. Fairness, she discovered, was more useful than kindness. Kindness required trust to mean anything. Fairness worked whether you trusted the person or not. December settled in hard. The storms came in clusters. 3 or 4 days of blizzard, then a brief period of hard, bright cold where the sky was so clear it looked fake, then another cluster. On the clear days, Silas went out. On the storm days, they were both inside the cabin together, all 16 square feet of it, with nothing between them but tasks and the slow passage of hours. Those days were the difficult ones. Not because they fought. They didn't fight often, and when they did, it was usually about something practical that resolved itself practically. But because the silence between them on those days had a different quality than the silence on days when Silas was gone. When he was gone, the silence was just the cabin. When he was there, the silence was two people choosing not to speak, which is a completely different thing and requires considerably more energy. She tried early on to fill the silence with questions. He answered them, but there was always a point where he'd given the question everything he intended to give it, and he'd go quiet again, and pushing past that point felt like pushing against a locked door. Not hostile, but complete. So she learned to let the silence exist. And then gradually, she learned to exist inside it without it costing her anything. It was on one of those storm days, about 3 weeks in, that she found the books. She'd been reorganizing the lower shelf. Silas had asked her to take inventory of the dry goods, which she'd done, which had taken 40 minutes, and she was looking for something else useful to do. And behind a row of canned goods, she found 4 books. Old, battered, spines cracked and retaped in some cases. She pulled them out. A field guide to North American mammals. A book on rope knot construction. A novel she didn't recognize, the cover missing. And a worn volume of poetry by someone she'd heard of but never read. She held up the novel. "Can I borrow this?" Silas was at the table sharpening a blade with long, slow strokes. He glanced at the book. Fine. She read it in 4 days. It was a good book. She hadn't expected it to be, given the condition it was in, but she got entirely absorbed in it and twice let the fire burn lower than she should have because she forgot to check it. Both times she caught it before it went out. Both times she didn't mention it to Silas. Both times she suspected he noticed anyway, from the position of the coals when he looked over, but he said nothing, which she decided was mercy and accepted accordingly. When she finished it, she said, "This is a good book." He looked up. "It is." "How many times have you read it?" A slight pause. "Several." She looked at the cover. No cover, the raw board beneath where it had been. "How'd you end up with it?" He went back to the blade. "Man I used to trade with, he was clearing out some things." A pause. "Didn't know what to do with books. Figured I'd take them." "You like to read?" He didn't answer, which she'd learned could mean different things. Sometimes it meant the question didn't warrant a response, and sometimes it meant the response existed, but he'd decided not to give it. She thought this was the second kind. "I used to like to read," she said. "Before. We didn't have money for books, mostly. I'd get them from people who were throwing them out." She looked at the book in her hands. "I missed it, not having them." Silence. "What's the poetry like?" she said. "Hard to understand sometimes." He set the blade down and looked at it. "But there's 1 or 2 that are worth the trouble. Can I read that next?" "Yes." She put the novel back in its spot and took the poetry volume to the cot. She didn't read it that night. She was tired and her leg was aching from a longer day than usual, but she held it for a while before she fell asleep, the way she'd held books as a child, like the weight of them was something, like pages under her fingers meant she was still connected to a world outside the one she was living in. Oh, ma'am. The first time she cooked something from scratch, not the soup, which was ongoing but an actual meal, rabbit stew with the dried herbs she'd found on the rafters, and some root vegetables from the cache. Silas ate half the bowl before he said anything. Then he said, "What did you put in this?" She told him. He listened. "The time's too much," he said. "Too much. But how is it otherwise?" He looked at the bowl, back at her. A very particular pause. "Better than what I make." She felt something warm move through her chest and immediately told it to be quiet. "I'll use less time next time. Little bit more of the rosemary, less time." "Okay." He finished the bowl. She ate her own and tried not to feel pleased about it and failed, privately, in a way she hoped wasn't visible. That meal was the beginning of a small adjustment in the cabin's atmosphere. Not dramatic. Nothing about Silas was dramatic. But after that, when he came home from the mountain, he'd sometimes tell her what he'd seen out there. Not a lot. Never a lot. Just pieces. A frozen creek he'd crossed, a set of tracks he didn't recognize, the way the ice had formed on the north face of a ridge. Things he'd observed. Like he was filing a report with someone who might find it useful. She started doing the same. Things she'd noticed in the cabin during the day. Small things. A seam in the roof log that seemed to be letting in cold. A jar of dried, something she'd found in the back of a shelf that she couldn't identify. a strange sound the stove had made in the morning before it settled. They were exchanging information. It wasn't conversation exactly, not in any way she'd used the word before, but it was something. The argument that almost broke the arrangement happened in the 5th week. She'd been attempting to stretch and cure a larger pelt, a beaver, which Silas had brought back from a longer run and left with instructions that were clear, but which she'd apparently misunderstood at a crucial step. She'd used the wrong scraper on the membrane, the bigger one, instead of the smaller finishing scraper, and she'd damaged the pelt significantly. Not ruined, she thought, she hoped, but damaged. When Silas came back and looked at it, his face went very still. "That's wrong," he said. "I know. I used the wrong. That pelt was 3 days of trapping." His voice was flat. Not raised, but flat in a way that was worse somehow. "That's a week of supplies if I trade it right. If it's damaged, it's worth half." "I understand that." She kept her voice steady. "I made a mistake. I'm telling you what I did wrong. I showed you which scraper. You showed me once, 2 weeks ago, and I was watching you do rabbit at the time, and I confused them. That's my fault, and I'm not arguing that." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you what happened so you can correct me. I'm not going to pretend I didn't do it." He looked at the pelt, then at her. The muscle in his jaw was working. "If I'd wanted to pretend it didn't happen," she said, more quietly, "I could have just put it back where it was and said nothing. The damage isn't obvious until you look closely." A long pause. "Why didn't you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Because that's not how I want to do this." She meant the winter, the cabin, the whole improbable arrangement they'd fallen into. "If I make a mistake, I'd rather just say so." He stood there for another moment. Then he picked up the pelt and examined it more carefully, turning it in his hands, pressing at the damaged area with his thumb. "It's not ruined," he said finally, "but I'll need to work it more before I can trade it." "I'll help. You'll watch first." He sat down and pulled the small scraper from the tool rack. "Then you'll help." "Okay." He worked in silence for a few minutes. She sat across from him and watched his hands. He had good hands. She'd noticed that before. Big and scarred and knowledgeable. The hands of someone who'd spent decades making things and fixing things and working through problems with them. "The small scraper has a curved edge," he said, without looking up. "The big one is straight. You can tell by feel." "I see it now. I'll know next time." "There won't always be a next time for some mistakes." "I know that." She paused. "But there will be a next time for this one, so I'm going to learn it." He glanced up at her for a fraction of a second, then back to the pelt. They worked on it together until the light was too dim to continue. The pelt was salvageable. Not perfect, but tradable. Neither of them mentioned it again. January arrived with a cold so severe that even Silas stayed inside for 4 days straight. That was unusual enough to tell her something about the temperature outside. If Silas Crow, who checked his traps in blizzards and came home from all-day mountain runs with the same expression he'd left with, decided that 4 days in a row were too dangerous to go out, then the outside was genuinely lethal. The cabin felt smaller. That wasn't quite rational. The walls hadn't moved. But with 2 people in it all day every day for 4 straight days, the air itself seemed compressed. On the 2nd day, she taught him to play cards. She'd found a deck in her coat pocket. She'd forgotten she had it, had been carrying it since before the mountain crossing, a habit from childhood when her brother Marcus had taught her every card game he knew. The deck was damaged at the edges and missing 2 cards, but playable for most things. "Do you know any card games?" she asked. He was doing something with a piece of rope, some kind of knot she hadn't seen before. "No." "Do you want to learn one?" A pause that she'd gotten better at reading. This one was the pause that meant he was deciding whether to admit he was interested. "What kind?" "I know 6. Some are better for 2 players than others. There's one called Rummy that's good with 2. He set down the rope. "Show me." She showed him. He picked it up quickly. She'd expected that somehow, the same way he absorbed any procedural information by paying close attention and asking specific questions. He lost the first 2 hands. He won the 3rd and 4th by a substantial margin, which made her suspect he'd been losing on purpose while he worked out the strategy, though she couldn't prove it. "You did that on purpose," she said, putting her losing hand face up on the table. He collected the cards and shuffled them with more competence than he should have had for someone who'd never played cards 20 minutes ago. Did what on purpose? Lost those first two hands while you figured out how I play. A pause. I was learning the game. You were learning my game. Something moved in his face that she had almost never seen there. Something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. A crease at the corner of his mouth, a slight shift around his eyes. Deal again, he said. She dealt again. He won that hand too, but she came close, and they played for another 2 hours with neither of them mentioning how long they'd been playing, which felt like an achievement of its own specific kind. The thing about being trapped with someone is that you cannot manage the information they gather about you. Alara had tried, in the first weeks, to be careful, to present only what she chose to present, capable, practical, not complaining, not frightened, not whatever she was underneath the surface she was trying to hold together. She'd gotten good at that kind of management over years of living in a household where showing too much of yourself gave people things to use against you. But the cabin defeated it. The cabin was too small and the winter was too long and Silas was too observant in his quiet, undemonstrative way. He noticed when her leg was bad. He never asked about it directly, but he'd arrange things slightly differently on those days. Put the water bucket closer to where she was working, or come back earlier from the mountain so she didn't have to manage the heavier evening chores alone. He never announced that he was doing this. She never thanked him for it. They maintained a mutual fiction that it wasn't happening, which was, she thought, the only way it could keep happening without becoming something they had to talk about. She noticed things about him too, against her will, in the way you notice things about someone you're watching involuntarily because there's nothing else to watch. He had nightmares. Not often, but she heard them. Sudden sounds from the floor in the middle of the night. Not quite words. A stifled quality to them. Like someone trying to keep quiet. They never lasted long. By the time she was fully awake, he'd have gone quiet again. And in the morning, there was never any sign that it had happened. She never mentioned it. He didn't sleep through thunderstorms. When the weather was just wind and snow, he was fine. But when there was actual thunder, rare in winter but not unheard of, he came awake and stayed awake, though he lay still and didn't do anything except be awake. She knew because she was a light sleeper, and she could tell the difference between sleeping stillness and the stillness of someone consciously holding themselves quiet. She didn't mention that either. What she did mention, one evening in late January when they'd been playing cards and the conversation had gone somewhere she hadn't planned. You said you've been here 6 years. Yes. He was looking at his cards. Where were you before? A long pause. She watched him decide something. South, he said finally. Different territory. Worked with a logging company for a while. Before that, ranching. What brought you up here? He set his cards face down and looked at the table for a moment. Needed a change of circumstance. She understood that phrase, understood that it was the phrase someone used when the actual answer was too large or too private for casual conversation. She nodded and picked up her cards and didn't push. He said, after a moment, You don't ask past what people want to give. She looked up. No. Why not? She thought about it. Because I know what it feels like when someone does. He looked at her. Really looked at her, in the way he rarely did. Directly and for longer than a moment. Fair enough, he said finally. He picked his cards back up. They played out the hand. She won, for once, though she suspected he let her, and she didn't call him on it this time because some things were better left unprovable. February was harder than January. The food stores, which had seemed enormous in November, were visibly shrinking. Silas had been tracking them all along, but she knew that from the way he'd occasionally stand at the shelves and look at them, doing calculations she couldn't follow. But in February, she started tracking them too, counting jars on the lower shelf, estimating what was left in the cache. Are we going to have enough? She asked him one morning. He was lacing his boots, getting ready to go out despite a wind that was rattling the door in its frame. Depends on how much longer the winter runs hard. And if it runs hard until April? He looked at her. We'll be careful. I want to know the actual math, she said. I can help manage it better if I understand where we actually are. He stood up. He looked at the shelves for a moment, and then he told her. Not approximately. Specifically. What they had, what the estimated consumption rate was, what the gap looked like if winter extended past the projected end date. She listened, memorizing numbers. When he finished, she said, "So if it runs long, we're short by roughly 3 weeks of food at current rates." "Yes." "What if we drop consumption by a third? 2 of those 3 weeks covered. The third is weather dependent. If I can get out consistently from late March, hunting supplements the stores." "Okay," she thought. "What can we cut?" He looked at her steadily. "You'd be hungry." "I'm already hungry some days." "Hungrier than that?" "I know what hungry is." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking if it will be comfortable. I'm asking what we can cut so that the math works." A pause. Then, with something in his expression she was becoming reluctantly familiar with, that particular quality that wasn't quite respect but was close to it, the look of someone recalibrating, he said, "Breakfast portion, down by a third. Supper stays because that's what you need for overnight." "Okay, what else?" "Reduce the soup pot, less meat, more water and root. I can compensate with whatever I bring back from trapping." "Deal," she nodded. "We start tomorrow." He nodded, put on his outer coat, got to the door and stopped. "You understand this is going to be unpleasant," he said, not turning around. "Silas?" She said his name and he stopped. "I understand. I'm not asking you to make it pleasant. I'm asking you to tell me the truth so I can deal with the actual situation instead of a version of it that's easier to hear." A long pause. Then he opened the door and went out into the wind, and she stood in the warmth of the cabin and looked at the shelves and started rearranging her understanding of the next 2 months. She had entered this cabin with nothing but a crippled leg and a note from her mother telling her she was strong. She did not know yet how true that would need to be. But she was beginning to understand that whatever came next, she wasn't going to face it the way she'd faced everything before. Uncertain, dependent, waiting for someone to tell her how much room she was allowed to take up. She set about making breakfast at the reduced portion, measured carefully, put the extra back where it had come from. She did not enjoy the smaller amount when she ate it, but she ate it without resentment, which felt, all things considered, like a different kind of strength than the one her mother had imagined. Outside, the February wind pushed against the walls and the mountain held its cold, patient grip on everything in every direction. And the cabin and the 2 people inside it went on. He came back wrong. She knew it before she saw him clearly, knew it from the sound of him at the door, which was off. Silas moved with a specific quality of certainty, boots hitting the ground in a pattern she'd memorized without meaning to, the particular thud of his pack dropping before he worked the door latch. That evening, in late February, the sound was different. Slower. Uneven. Something dragging. She was at the stove when the door opened and she turned and looked and her stomach dropped. He was standing in the doorway holding himself up against the frame with one arm, and his right leg was wrong. His canvas trousers were dark from the knee down, dark in the way fabric gets when something wet has soaked through and frozen and thawed and soaked through again. And he was holding that leg slightly off the ground without seeming to realize he was doing it, his weight distributed entirely to his left side and the arm braced against the door. His face was the color of old ash. "Silas." She was already moving. "I'm fine." He said it automatically, the way a person says a thing that isn't true because they've committed to it. "You're not fine." She got to him and looked at the leg and didn't touch it yet. The dark patch ran from mid-thigh down to his boot top. "What happened?" He moved past her into the cabin, one hand trailing along the wall. "Trap. Steel jaw trap. Fouled mechanism. Sprung when I was clearing it." He made it to the table and put both hands on it and stood there, breathing through his nose in a way that told her the breathing required deliberate management. "Caught me just above the knee. Steel teeth." She looked at his face. The ash color, the deliberate breathing. He'd walked home from wherever the trap was. How far? Miles, maybe. On a leg that a steel jaw trap had closed on. "Sit down," she said. "I need to—" "Sit down, Silas." He sat. Not because she told him to, she understood that much about him by now, but because his body had been making the decision for him for a while and had finally finished arguing about it. She crouched in front of him and looked at the leg. The trousers needed to come off, or at least up, but she could already see through the soaked fabric that the wound was bad. The shape of his thigh was wrong, not dramatically, not the wrongness of a break, but a swelling that was already thick and tight-looking even through the cloth. "I need to look at it," she said. "Can you get the trousers off, or should I cut them?" He looked at her for a moment. Something behind his eyes was working. Pain management, she thought. The mental process of controlling how much of the pain he was letting himself experience. "Cut them," he said. "Faster." She got the hunting knife from the table, his knife, always on the table when he was home, always sharp. She'd learned that. And she cut the right trouser leg from knee to hip and peeled the fabric back, and then she had to work very hard not to let her face show what she was seeing. The trap had caught him high on the thigh, above where most traps got an animal. She'd learned enough about the trap mechanics by now to understand this was bad positioning, that the meat of the thigh was deep and blood-rich in ways that a lower catch wasn't. The wound was 2 parallel gashes, each about 3 inches long, deep, already swollen and angry red around the edges. One of them was still seeping. The other had started to clot, but the clot was thin and fragile-looking, the kind that wouldn't survive much movement. There was a smell. Faint, but there. She recognized it from a bad wound her brother Marcus had gotten years ago from a rusted fence post. The beginning of something that, if left alone, became something else entirely. "When did this happen?" she asked. "This morning. Early." He said it with his eyes closed. She looked at him. Early. He'd been walking on this for most of a day. "Do you have anything for infection?" She was already standing, moving to the shelves. "Spirits, carbolic, anything. Tin on the 3rd shelf, green lid." His voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. Something she recognized as the sound of a person running out of reserves. She found the tin. Opened it. Pine tar salve, with something else mixed in. She couldn't identify it, but it smelled medicinal and sharp. There was also behind it a dark glass bottle with a cork stopper. She pulled it out, smelled it. Strong spirits, homemade probably, the kind that could take paint off wood. "Both of these?" she said. "Spirits first, then the salve." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "There's a needle and thread in the bottom drawer of the chest. Wax thread, heavy. You'll need it." She stared at him. "Silas." "The deep one needs stitching." His voice was patient, which was somehow worse than if it had been afraid. "If it stays open overnight, we lose the battle before it starts." "I've never stitched a wound. I know." He looked at her steadily. "Neither have I, on myself." She stood there for just a moment, just one moment, in which she let herself understand the full shape of the situation. Silas Crow, who had pulled her out of the snow and kept her alive through the worst winter she'd ever known, was sitting at his own table with a wound that would kill him slowly if it went wrong. And the only person available to help was her, and she had no experience with any of this, and there was no one coming. One moment, that was all she gave it. Then she went to the chest and found the needle and thread. "Tell me exactly what to do," she said, "and don't leave anything out because you think I can't handle it." He told her. He talked her through it in the same voice he'd used to teach her to cure a pelt and bank a fire and read the weather from the shape of clouds on the ridgeline. Factual, precise, no extras. Clean it first with the spirits, all the way into the wound. Don't flinch from the depth of it. Pack the shallower gash with the salve. The deep one needs the edges together and held. Small stitches, close together, don't pull hard on the thread. The skin is already tight from swelling. She cleaned the wound with the spirits. Silas made one sound, a short, controlled sound that he pressed his lips together immediately after, and gripped the edge of the table and said nothing. She packed the shallower wound. Then she threaded the needle and she sat on the stool in front of him and she looked at the deep gash and she took 3 slow breaths and she started. It was terrible. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, even to herself. The needle didn't want to go through swollen, inflamed tissue the way it went through normal skin. It required more pressure than she'd expected, and the first 2 stitches were too far apart, and she had to take them out and redo them, which was worse than doing them the first time. Her hands were steady. She did not understand why her hands were steady. She would have expected them to shake, but they were. And she used that and didn't question it. Silas looked at the wall the entire time. His grip on the table turned his knuckles white. But he didn't move the leg, didn't pull back, didn't make another sound. He just looked at the wall and breathed. 7 stitches. She counted as she put them in. Small and tight, the way he'd told her. The thread pulled just enough to draw the edges together without tearing. When she tied off the last one and cut the thread and sat back, her shoulders were aching from the tension she'd been holding in them without realizing. She looked at the work. It wasn't beautiful. The stitches were uneven and the second one was slightly puckered. But the wound was closed and the edges were together, and that was what mattered. "Done," she said. He looked down at it for the first time. A long pause. "Good," he said. She applied the pine tar salve over the stitches and bound the wound with clean cloth from a stack she found on the middle shelf. And when she was finished, she looked up at his face, and the ash color was still there, but the particular tightness around his eyes had eased slightly. "You need to be off that leg," she said. "I need to—" "What?" She looked at him. "What do you need to do that can't wait?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "Tell me," she said. "Whatever it is, I'll do it, but you're going to the cot." He told her by The dogs needed feeding. There was an unfinished task with a pelt he'd been working the previous day. The fire would need an extra feed in 2 hours because the temperature was dropping again. She listened, memorized, nodded. Getting him to the cot was its own challenge. He was a large man and he was trying to help, and he was also significantly impaired by blood loss and a wound that had been walked on for 9 hours. And the combination made the 12 feet between the table and the cot feel considerably longer. She ended up taking most of his weight on her left side, her good side, and moving slowly and not saying anything when her right leg complained about the extra load. He lay down on the cot with the specific, careful movement of someone managing serious pain, and she covered him with the heavy blanket, and he looked at the ceiling and said, "I don't want you to think this will become a regular problem." She almost laughed. It came up suddenly, and she pressed her lips together before it got out, because laughing felt wrong even if it was the real response. "Go to sleep," she said instead. "I mean it. I know you do." She pulled the blanket up to his chest. "You can explain how self-sufficient you are after the fever breaks." He looked at her sharply. "I don't have a fever." She put her hand against his forehead, which she hadn't done yet, and he went very still at the contact. His skin was hot. Not raging, not yet, but hot in the wrong direction. "You don't have a bad fever yet," she said, pulling her hand back. "That's different." He said nothing. His jaw tightened. She recognized that as the expression of a man receiving information he didn't want and had no argument against. "I'll check it again in an hour," she said. "Sleep if you can." She went and fed the dogs and managed the fire and saw to the pelt. And when she came back in an hour, his eyes were closed and his breathing was slow. And she stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. This large, scarred, difficult man who had pulled her out of the snow and given her nothing except honesty and the tools to keep herself alive. And she felt something settle in her chest with a weight she didn't try to name. She checked his forehead. Hotter. She built the fever kit the way she'd seen her mother do it, once, years ago. Wet cloth, cool not cold, draped across the forehead and changed when it warmed. She pulled her stool to the side of the cot, and she sat there, and she did this through the night. The fever peaked on the second day, and she thought for about 4 hours that she was going to lose him. He was not delirious in the way she'd heard people got with fever. He didn't talk nonsense or thrash or say things he didn't mean. He was just very hot, in the way that was wrong enough to be frightening, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. And when he was conscious, he was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Less like a choice, more like an absence. She managed everything. The fire, the food, smaller amounts now, feeding him broth when he was awake enough to take it, half a cup at a time, patient about the slowness of it. The dogs. The water stores. The wound, which she checked twice a day, cleaning it again with the spirits each time. He bore it each time with the same contained stillness, eyes fixed on the wall, hands loose at his sides instead of gripping anything, which she thought was a decision he'd made rather than an improvement in the pain level. The cabin, which had felt small with 2 people sharing it more or less equally, felt enormous when she was the only one upright. The tasks that they'd divided between them, that they'd never formally divided, that had simply distributed themselves over weeks according to capacity and availability, now fell entirely on her, and she ran the calculations the way he'd taught her to, and found that they were barely covered, that she could manage it all, but there was no margin. On the second evening, she split firewood for the first time. She hadn't done it before. Silas had always handled it, going out to the woodpile before dark and splitting what was needed for the next day or two. She knew the general principle. She'd watched him enough times. She knew how to hold the axe, where to aim, how to let the weight of the head do most of the work. Knowing and doing were, she discovered, not quite the same thing. The first 6 pieces were ugly. She hit wrong twice and glanced off without splitting, and once she hit right but the log was knotted and didn't want to give, and she had to hit it 3 more times, each time slightly less accurate than the last as her arms tired. Her right leg was complaining about the stance. She needed to adjust, favor the left, which changed her swing angle, which she had to compensate for. She split 12 pieces. It took her 45 minutes. Her arms ached down to the bone. She carried them inside and stacked them and went back out for more. And this time it took her 30 minutes, which was still too long but was better. And she filed the improvement in the same place she filed everything she was learning. That night she sat beside the cot and changed the cloth on his forehead, and he opened his eyes and looked at her with the glassy quality of someone who was present, but not fully present. "You've been out there," he said. His voice was rough, drier than usual. "Splitting wood." A pause. "You don't know how to split wood." "I do now." She folded the cloth, put it back on his forehead. "You should drink something." "How bad is it?" He meant the wood, she thought, the quality of it. "Functional," she said, "not pretty." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, he was too sick for that, but the territory adjacent to it. "Drink the broth," she said. He drank the broth. Slowly, with the particular patience of someone who'd accepted that their body was operating under constraints. She watched him drink it and thought about how strange it was to be sitting here in this position, the one tending instead of the one tended, the one making the decisions instead of waiting to be told what to do. When had that changed? She wasn't sure exactly. Gradually enough that she hadn't noticed until the gradual had become complete. "Elara!" Her name in his mouth, said so rarely that it still caught her slightly off guard. "What?" "If it goes wrong," he stopped, started again. "If it goes septic, if I go the wrong way, there's gold in the chest, bottom, underneath the spare blanket, enough to get you south when the pass is clear." She looked at him for a moment. "You're not going the wrong way. I'm telling you in case." "I heard you." She took the empty cup. "You're not going the wrong way." He held her gaze for a moment. Whatever he saw there apparently satisfied whatever he'd been checking for, because he closed his eyes. "The stitching was good work," he said, to the inside of his eyelids apparently. "Go to sleep, Silas." He went to sleep. She sat there in the near dark for a while after, listening to his breathing, measuring it, the way she measured everything now, looking for the information in it. It was steadier than it had been that morning. The heat in him was still there, but she thought cautiously that it might be slightly less than it had been at the peak. She didn't let herself feel relieved yet. Relief was something you could afford when the thing was over, not while it was still happening. She'd learned that from him, though he'd never said it directly. Just modeled it the way he modeled everything, by doing it consistently and without comment until it became part of the air in the room. The fever broke on the third morning. She knew because she woke up. She'd been sleeping on the floor, on the furs, in the spot Silas had slept for months while she took the cot, and she heard him moving and sat up fast, the way she'd been coming awake for 3 days, immediately and completely, no fog between sleep and function. He was sitting up on the cot, still pale, still clearly in pain, but present in a way he hadn't been. The glassy quality was gone. He was looking around the cabin with his normal assessing expression, taking inventory. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't what?" "Don't try to get up yet. Don't inventory the cabin and start calculating what I've gotten wrong. Just sit there for a minute." A pause. "I'm not going to find what you've gotten wrong." "You might. I split the firewood badly. Some of it is knotted and it won't sit in the stove right. I have to break it down smaller, which wastes time." She stood up off the floor and straightened her back. "I'm aware of that. You don't need to point it out." He looked at her for a long moment. "The wound," he said. Can I see it? She helped him unwrap the binding. They both looked at the stitches. The wound was still angry-looking, red and swollen at the edges. The skin around it bruised through a spectrum from yellow to deep purple. But the stitches were holding, the edges closed, and the smell from the first night was gone. "The redness," she said. "Is that bad?" "Inflammation." He pressed very carefully at the skin beside the wound. His jaw tightened. "It's working through it. Not the same as infection." He looked at it for another moment. "You did well. You told me what to do." "I told you what to do. You did it." He met her eyes. "Those aren't the same thing." She handed him the binding cloth to hold the stitches covered, and she went to build up the fire. Her back was to him when she did it, which was good, because she was not entirely sure what her face was doing, and she didn't particularly want to find out. He was off the leg for 12 days in total. The first 5 he spent mostly sleeping and eating the broth she made and accepting, with visible difficulty, that he was not in a position to do much else. On the 6th day, he made it to the table under his own power and sat there and sharpened every blade in the cabin, which was not physically demanding but kept his hands occupied, and she recognized this as a concession to his own limits that cost him something. On the 7th day, he started teaching her things from the table. She'd ask questions about what she was doing. She'd been asking questions all along, but now they were more specific, more technical. And he'd answer from where he sat, sometimes sketching something on the small piece of paper he kept for noting trap locations, sometimes just talking her through it verbally. How to judge when a pelt was fully cured by feel and not just by time. How to read the wind direction from inside the cabin by watching the smoke from the stovepipe through the shutter crack. How to set a snare, the theory of it, because she couldn't practice yet, but she could understand. She absorbed everything. She asked when she didn't understand. She attempted things, and sometimes did them wrong, and said so, and tried again. On the 9th day, she went out and checked the nearest 2 trap lines by herself. He'd told her where they were, described the route in enough detail that she'd been able to follow it. She'd taken the smaller pack and his second pair of snowshoes, too big, she stuffed them with spare cloth. And she'd gone out in the hard, cold morning and found both traps and reset one of them and come back with a rabbit and a small expression of fierce satisfaction that she made sure was gone by the time she pushed through the door. She held up the rabbit. He looked at it. "Good. The north line trap was empty," she said. "The position's wrong. It's too exposed. Animals are going around it. I moved it under the spruce overhang 20 feet east." He was quiet for a moment. "That's where I had it originally," he said. "I moved it because of a drift that formed last season. The drift's gone now. The overhang position reads better." He nodded slowly. "All right." She hung the rabbit on the outside hook and came back in and started removing her outer layers, and she could feel him looking at her. And she didn't comment on it, and he didn't say whatever he was thinking, which was its own kind of communication, the kind they'd gotten good at over months of sharing 16 square feet with nothing between them but honesty and necessity. What had shifted between them in those 12 days was something she hadn't expected and couldn't fully name. Not tenderness, exactly. She didn't think either of them were built for that kind of thing, or at least not readily. Something more structural than that. Something in how they stood relative to each other. Before, there had always been a slight asymmetry. Silas knew the mountain, the cabin, the work, and Alara was learning it. The debt ran one direction. She'd tried to pay it down with labor and competence and refusal to complain. But the underlying architecture of the arrangement had always been that he was the one who knew, and she was the one catching up. Those 12 days had rearranged something. She'd kept them both alive, not dramatically, not in any single heroic act, but in the relentless daily accumulation of right decisions and hard work and attention to what mattered. She'd stitched his leg and broken his fever and split firewood badly and then better and managed the dogs and the fire and the food stores and the trap lines, and when she'd made mistakes, she'd fixed them, and when she didn't know something, she'd figured it out. He knew she'd done all of it. He'd been there, in and out of consciousness, watching what he could from the cot, and something in how he looked at her was different. Not softer. She didn't want softer, from him or from anyone. Soft was what you got instead of truth, and she'd had enough of that to last her. But there was something in his directness now that was different from the directness of those first weeks, when he'd been assessing whether she was capable. He wasn't assessing anymore. He'd apparently concluded something, at some point during the fever days, and the assessment had been set aside and replaced with something else. She didn't push at it. She just let it exist and kept working. On the 12th day, Silas stood up from the table and put on his outer coat and picked up his pack. "I'll take the South Line today," he said. "Short run, back by midday." She looked at him. "Your leg is functional." He said it in the tone that meant the subject was settled. "I'll favor it." She watched him do up the coat buttons. He was still slightly too pale, and she could tell from the careful way he distributed his weight as he moved that the leg was giving him more trouble than functional covered. But the leg was not her decision. "Take the shorter snowshoes," she said. "The strap on the left one on the big pair is still repaired, but I haven't finished the splice properly." He looked at her. Then he switched snowshoes without argument. She stood in the doorway and watched him go out into the cold, bright morning, moving with a slightly altered gait, but moving steadily. And she thought about the note under the stone on the mountain, the round backward handwriting, the phrase that had been meant as comfort, and become instead something she'd turned into a different shape entirely. "You are strong. You will find a way." She was. She had. She would keep doing both. The door closed behind him and the cabin settled into its daytime quiet, and she turned back to the work because the work didn't stop, and she was the one here to do it. March came in mean. She'd expected some kind of softening. Everyone talked about March as the beginning of the end of winter, the first whisper of something warmer, working its way up from lower elevations. But on this mountain, at this height, March just meant the cold got angry before it gave up. The storms were shorter, but more violent. The temperatures swung wildly, almost warm one afternoon and then dropping 30 degrees by the following morning, which was worse in some ways than steady cold because it made the snowpack unstable and the ice on the trails treacherous and unpredictable. Silas's leg had healed enough that he was back to full days on the mountain, though Alara noticed, and said nothing about, the way he came home some evenings and sat down at the table with a particular careful stillness that meant the leg had been giving him trouble and he was waiting for it to stop. The stitches had come out 10 days after she'd put them in. The wound closed to a thick pink scar that she thought would probably stay pink for years. He'd looked at it briefly when she removed the stitches, said nothing, and gone back to repairing a trap spring. The food situation was manageable. Barely. They'd been running at the reduced portion since February, and the March hunting had improved enough with the longer days that Silas was supplementing the stores more consistently. She was down to 1 card game in the evening instead of 2 because the lantern oil needed rationing. But she'd started doing things by firelight that she'd previously needed the lantern for. Curing work, mending, the ongoing maintenance of small things that kept the cabin functional. She realized somewhere in the first week of March, genuinely competent now. Not in everything. She still made mistakes on the traps, still occasionally misjudged the fire, still burned things she was cooking when her attention went elsewhere. But she was competent in the way that a person becomes competent when they've been doing the same things every day for months, with consequences for getting them wrong. Not confident exactly, but grounded. She knew what she knew. She knew what she didn't know. The gap between those two things had narrowed considerably. Silas had started leaving her alone for longer runs without what she thought of as his pre-departure instructions. The careful itemization of what needed doing, what to watch for, what to avoid. He still told her if there was something specific, something different from the usual day, but he'd stopped treating every departure as a teaching moment, which she understood as a sign that he no longer thought she needed it. She hadn't said anything about noticing this, neither had he. It was a Thursday. She'd started keeping rough track of days again, something she'd abandoned in the worst of winter when days had blurred into an undifferentiated mass of cold and work and sleep. When Silas went out for a longer run than usual, he'd told her the night before that he wanted to check the far north trap line, the one that extended past the second ridge. He hadn't been up there since before the leg wound. The run was a full day, out before light, back before dark, but only barely, and only if the weather held. The weather held through morning. She managed the cabin, checked the nearer trap lines herself, came back with 2 rabbits, and a sense of the sky that she'd learned to read over months of watching Silas read it. By early afternoon, the sky to the northwest was doing something she didn't like. A particular flat gray that she'd seen before, usually preceding the fast-moving storms that came in off the high peaks without much warning. She watched it from the doorway for a while. Then she went in and kept working. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up. By late afternoon, when Silas should have been starting back and wasn't, the storm had come in completely. She wasn't worried yet. She made herself not be worried yet. He knew the mountain better than anyone, knew where to shelter, knew how to read the conditions. He'd been out in worse than this. She built the fire up higher than usual so there'd be a good heat waiting for him when he came back, and she put the larger pot on with more meat than their rations strictly called for because he'd have been out all day and would come back cold and burning reserves. She waited. The light outside the shutter cracks went from gray to dark. He was not back. She sat at the table and dealt herself a hand of cards and played it without paying attention to it because her hands needed something to do that wasn't fidgeting. She played 3 hands. She was not tracking the cards. She stacked the deck and set it down. The dogs were restless. She could hear them outside, a low sound under the wind, not barking but moving in their runs in a way that was different from normal. She'd learned to read them too over the months. They were animals tuned to the mountain in ways she was still catching up to. And when they were unsettled without obvious cause, it usually meant something was wrong with the conditions outside, something the human sensory system didn't pick up as quickly. She put on her outer coat. She stood at the door for a moment with her hand on the latch. Outside was a full mountain storm at night, and she had no idea where Silas was except somewhere on the far north line, which was miles away, terrain she'd never covered, conditions she had no business being out in alone. She was aware of all of this. She also stood there and listened to the dogs, and thought about the fact that Silas Crow had never once, in all the months they'd been in this cabin together, been late without a reason she already knew about. She opened the door. The storm hit her like a flat hand. Snow horizontal, temperature already dropped hard from the afternoon, the wind taking everything and throwing it sideways. She got the door shut behind her and stood on the small covered porch and looked out into the dark and the white and thought, rationally and clearly, I cannot find him in this. I don't know the far north line. I don't know the terrain. I would get lost inside of 20 minutes. The rational thing was to go back inside and wait. She went back inside. She lasted 9 minutes. What she did have was the rifle. Silas had 2 rifles in the rack, the heavy one he used for larger game, and the lighter one he'd started letting her use on the closer trap runs when there'd been sign of something that might cause trouble. She'd fired it twice in practice, enough to know the weight of it and how it kicked. She'd never fired it at anything living. She took the heavy one because she didn't know what was out there, and she loaded it the way he'd taught her with a patience she hadn't expected, and she put extra rounds in her coat pocket. Then she took the lantern, shuttered it as tight as it would go to keep the flame alive in the wind, and she went back out into the storm. She went north. She couldn't take the full far north line. She accepted that. She couldn't find her way to the second ridge in a storm at night without knowing the terrain. But she could go north from the cabin, toward where the line started, and she could use the lantern and she could make noise, and if Silas was somewhere out there within range of that noise and that light, he might find his way to it. She moved through this dark with her arm up against the wind, and her eyes narrowed to slits. The snow was thicker than it had looked from the porch. It was coming from 3 directions at once, which wasn't meteorologically possible and was happening anyway, catching and bouncing off the terrain in ways that made directions strange. She'd been walking for about 20 minutes when she heard it. Not Silas. Not a human sound. A sound she'd learned to identify over months of living on a mountain where things that weren't human also lived. Deep, rhythmic, close. Multiple sources. The specific bass quality of large animals communicating at a register that sat just above the threshold of sound you felt rather than heard. Wolves. She stopped. She adjusted her grip on the rifle, and she adjusted the lantern, and she moved toward the sound, because the sound was north, and north was where Silas had gone, and she could not think about it more carefully than that, or she would stop moving. The scene resolved out of the dark in pieces, the way things do when you're moving toward them in poor visibility. First, the shapes, several of them, low and circling. Then the center of the circle, which was larger and upright and still, which was the specific stillness of someone holding position because moving would make things worse. Silas was standing with his back against a rock outcropping. She could see, even from 30 feet away, the way he was standing, the weight on the left side, the right leg not cooperating. He had his hunting knife in his right hand. The knife was not going to be sufficient against 5 wolves, possibly 6. She was still counting shapes in the dark. The wolves hadn't seen her yet. The wind was coming from them toward her, which meant they couldn't smell her either. She had maybe 10 seconds before the storm's chaos randomized that advantage. She raised the rifle. She had fired it twice in practice, both times stationary, daylight, still air. She was standing in a mountain blizzard in the dark with a shuttered lantern that provided barely enough light to see by, wind pushing at her from 2 directions, and the target was a moving animal at 30 feet. She picked the largest wolf, the one that had angled closest to Silas. She fired. The sound in the confined space between the rock faces was enormous, physically felt as much as heard. She worked the action without thinking, Silas's voice in her memory, loading and cycling a rifle. Do it before you know you need to. And she had a second round chambered before she'd fully processed the first shot. She didn't need the second shot. The wolves scattered, not in all directions but away, which was what mattered. Away from Silas, away from her, into the dark in a mass of sudden motion. The one she'd shot was down. She wasn't going to look at it yet. The silence after the shot, under the wind, was enormous. Alara, his voice across the space between them, level and recognizable and present. I'm here. She walked toward him, the rifle still up out of habit, scanning the dark for movement. The wolves were gone. She could feel it the way the dogs had felt whatever was wrong earlier, a change in the quality of the air around her. Are you hurt? No. A pause. Came up on them on the way back. Couldn't maneuver well enough to create distance. The explanation was brief and factual, which was how she knew he was shaken. He was providing explanations she hadn't asked for, accounting for how he'd ended up cornered, which was not something he did unless he felt accountable for it. She reached him and she looked at him in the dim lantern light, and he was whole, cold, his face rigid with it, the right leg clearly hurting, but whole. The far line, he said. I stayed too long. Should have left earlier when the weather turned. Yes, she said. You should have. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that she couldn't fully read in the dark. You shot that in these conditions, he said. I didn't have a second option. He was quiet for a moment. That was 40 feet, at least. I thought 30. 40. He looked out toward where the wolf was. That was a difficult shot. I've had a good teacher. She said it without inflection and immediately moved on before it could become something. Can you walk back? Yes. Can you help me get that wolf back? She gestured in the direction of the shot. We need the meat. Another pause, this one containing something she didn't examine. Yes. They went and found the wolf together, in the dark and the wind, and they got it back to the cabin in stages because it was heavy, and between his leg and her bad knee, they were not exactly a complete physical unit. It took a long time, and neither of them talked much during it, saving the breath for the work. Inside, with the fire built up and both of them warming back to functional temperature, the wolf laid out in the cold side entry for the night. She made the largest meal she'd made in weeks. She used the extra meat she'd already put in the pot, and she added to it, and she didn't count the cost because there was a wolf outside that was now their resource, and they had both earned a proper meal tonight. Silas sat at the table and watched her cook and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, Why did you come out? Because you weren't back. I could have been sheltering, waiting out the storm. You could have been. She stirred the pot. But you weren't. A silence. You didn't know that, he said. No. She set the spoon down and looked at him. But I knew you were supposed to be back and you weren't, and the dogs were unhappy, and I couldn't stay inside and not know. He was looking at her with an expression she'd seen develop slowly over months and still couldn't entirely characterize. Not soft, never soft with him, but without the specific guardedness that had been there in the beginning, that careful containment of a man who had decided at some point that people were not safe to let close. That was reckless, he said, going out in that without knowing the terrain. Probably. She served the soup, set his bowl in front of him. But you'd have done the same. He looked at his bowl. Yes, he said quietly. I would have. They ate. Outside, the storm was still working through its anger, pressing at the walls, finding the gaps, doing what mountain storms did. Inside the fire was high and the food was hot, and the wolf was in the side entry representing 3 weeks of supplies that they'd earned in the most direct possible way. "That's a difficult shot," he said again, halfway through the bowl, looking at nothing in particular. "You've said that." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking about it." "Stop thinking about it and eat." He ate. She ate. The storm went on outside and they let it because they'd been letting the mountain do what it did all winter and responding to it, and this was the same thing. She thought about this first night, being dragged through the dark by a man she couldn't see, too cold to be afraid, too far gone to resist. She thought about the first morning, waking up to a cabin she didn't know with a man who moved through it like the space was an extension of himself, who looked at her with those assessing eyes and gave her the minimum of what she needed to understand her situation and waited to see what she'd do with it. She thought about all the distance between that night and this one. Not comfort, exactly. Not safety, which was a concept the mountain had revised for her entirely. Safety wasn't a state, it was a practice. Something you maintained through constant attention and correct decisions, and the willingness to go out into a blizzard when the alternative was sitting still and not knowing. But something. "Silas," she said. He looked up. She wasn't sure what she'd been going to say. She sat with it for a moment and decided it didn't need to be said in words. Whatever it was, it existed between them already, had been building all winter in the space between all the things they'd exchanged without saying them. "The wolf," she said instead. "I'll start on the hide tomorrow. It's a good one." He looked at her for a moment longer than the sentence required. "It is," he said. They finished eating. She washed the bowls. He banked the fire for the night with the precision of long habit. She took her position on the cot, hers, since the beginning, unchanged. And he took his place on the floor, unchanged. The lantern went out. In the dark, after a while, his voice, "You aimed left of center." She stared at the ceiling. "I aimed for the kill shot." "I know." A pause. "That's what I mean." She said nothing. The storm outside was quieter now, winding down. She had come to this mountain to die, more or less, or at least she had arrived here having been judged not worth keeping alive, and she had spent the winter doing the opposite of dying. And somewhere in there she had become something she hadn't been before. Not harder, exactly. Not colder, but more particular about what she chose to carry and what she set down. Her family had decided she was weight. She'd decided they were wrong. The fire breathed low in the stove, and the mountain settled around the cabin, and Elara Vance lay in the dark and felt something unfamiliar in her chest. Not happiness, not yet, that was too simple a word for whatever this was, but something in the neighborhood of it, something that didn't have a name yet but was real. The way the cold was real, the way the work was real, the way the man sleeping on the floor 6 feet away was real and present and no longer a stranger. Spring was coming. She didn't know what came with it. She slept. Spring did not arrive the way people in lower places imagined it. It didn't come overnight. It didn't announce itself. It crept in sideways, the way the cold had crept in back in November, in layers, incrementally, taking things back 1 degree at a time. The snow on the south-facing slope outside the cabin door developed a crust that melted by noon and refroze by dark. The icicles along the eave dripped during the warmest part of the afternoon. The light changed, not warmer exactly, but longer, the days stretching at both ends in a way that made the cabin feel less sealed. Elara noticed all of it. She'd become a person who noticed weather the way other people noticed the time, automatically, constantly, as orientation rather than interest. She knew what the quality of the morning light meant for the afternoon conditions. She knew what the particular sound of wind through the ridge gap above them predicted for the following day. She'd built this knowledge without intending to, one winter day at a time, until it was simply part of how she moved through the world. She was curing the wolf hide in late March when Silas came in from outside and said, "South Pass will be open inside of 3 weeks." She kept working. "How do you know?" "Ice on the creek below the first ridge is pulling back from the edges. Happens about 3 weeks before the pass clears, consistent as anything." He hung his coat and went to the shelves to assess the remaining stores the way he did every few days. "Temperature's running warmer than last year this time. Could be less than 3 weeks." She let the information sit for a moment. 3 weeks. She turned it over the way you turn over something whose weight you're not sure about yet. You'll want to be ready, he said, without looking up from the shelves. Ready for what? To go. He said it factually, the way he said most things. When the wagon trains start coming through, they move fast. You'd want to be at the lower trailhead to catch the first one heading south. She set down the scraping tool. She looked at his back, the broad set of his shoulders, the way he held himself at the shelves, doing the numbers in his head that he was always doing. You've been thinking about this since February. He turned around. His expression was the one she'd learned to read as him being careful with something, not guarded, but deliberate. I've been setting aside trade goods. The wolf pelt is worth more than you'd think, in good condition. The beaver from the North Line. Some of the dried stores I can spare. He paused. Enough to get you south and set up somewhere with something to work with. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. You've been planning this since February, she said. You've been planning my departure since February. She said it not as an accusation, more like reading a document out loud to confirm she'd understood it correctly. While we were cutting rations and working the trap lines and playing cards, you were also building me an exit. Something shifted in his face. It seemed the right thing to do. Why? He was quiet for a moment. He turned back to the shelves, which she recognized as a thing he did when a conversation had gotten into territory he hadn't fully mapped. Because what you came from was not enough for you, and a mountain trapping cabin in the middle of nowhere is not... He stopped. Started again. You have things you could do, somewhere with more than this. More than this, she repeated. People, work that's... He made a gesture that was rare from him, imprecise, the gesture of a man whose words had come up short. You're 23. You shouldn't spend your life out here. She sat with that for a moment. The fire was doing its afternoon thing, settling into the steady burn she'd learned to produce consistently. The wolf hide was stretched on the frame she'd built herself, poorly, but functionally, exactly the way she built most things now. What if I want to? She said. He turned around. What if I want to spend my life out here? She held his gaze. Is that something you've considered? He looked at her with the full directness he'd always used and said nothing, which was not the same as having no response. It was the look of a man encountering a variable he'd deliberately excluded from his calculations because accounting for it felt presumptuous. You haven't considered it, she said. I didn't think it was mine to consider. She stood up. Her right knee complained, the way it always complained when she'd been crouched over work for too long. And she straightened it and let it settle and crossed the cabin to the shelves where he was standing, and she looked at the goods he'd quietly assembled for her over the past month. The folded pelts, the small tied bundle of dried food, a leather pouch she hadn't seen before that was heavy in a way that meant coin. She picked up the pouch. Is this the gold from the chest? She said. Some of it. Silas. She set the pouch down. Look at me. He looked at her. She'd asked him to look at her directly a handful of times in the whole winter, usually because he'd been addressing something else while they were having a conversation that deserved full attention. Each time he'd done it without argument. He did it now. Tell me honestly, she said, and don't give me the answer you think is right. Tell me what's actually true. A pause. Do you want me to leave? The silence that followed was longer than most of their silences. The fire settled. Wind moved past the cabin outside, the lighter wind of early spring that was different from winter wind in a way she could feel in her bones now. No, he said. Just that. No qualification, no addition. Then why are you sending me away? Because wanting you to stay and it being right for you to stay are not the same thing. He said it with difficulty. She could see the difficulty, the way he worked through it. And I won't ask someone to stay for my benefit when they have options. She thought about that. It was so him, so entirely consistent with every fair and disciplined and frustrating thing about Silas Crow, that she almost wanted to shake him. The man who'd never once taken more than his share of anything, who'd taught her everything without holding any of it back, who'd slept on his own floor for 5 months without being asked and without making her feel indebted for it, who had built her an exit because he thought she deserved one, even though building it had cost him something. What if staying is what I want, she said. Not for your benefit, for mine. He was very still. I came to this mountain with nothing and no one, she said, and I built something here. Not you. I mean, the actual something. The knowledge, the capability, the ability to check a trap line and read a sky and stitch a wound and fire a rifle in a blizzard at 40 feet, apparently. She watched something move in his face. I'm not the person who was under that tree in November, and the person I am now was made here, on this mountain, with you. She didn't say the rest of it. She didn't need to. It was there in the air between them, in all the months of silences and shared meals and card games in the dark, and him on the floor, and her on the cot, and the specific quality of the trust that had built up between them without either of them naming it, because naming things was not how they did things. The cabin needs work, she said, when the silence had gone on long enough. The east wall seam has been letting cold in all winter. The woodpile needs rebuilding before next fall. The north line trap placements need reassessing in the summer when you can actually see the terrain without snow. She paused. That's a lot of work for one person. He looked at her for another long moment. Then, the roof over the storage side needs rethinking. Ice dam's been building up there all winter. She blinked. I didn't know about that. I've been managing it, but it needs a proper fix in summer. He held her gaze. 2 people would make that easier. Something shifted in her chest, warm and complicated and not quite nameable, which was appropriate, she supposed, given that she'd spent the winter learning that the most real things rarely had clean names. Then it settled, she said. He nodded once, picked up the leather coin pouch and held it for a moment, and then put it back in the chest where it had come from. Closed the lid. The wagon train came through in the second week of April. She heard it before she saw it. The sound of animals and wood and people carried up the mountain in the thin spring air, sounds she hadn't heard since November, sounds that belonged to a world that had continued existing without her while she'd been up here becoming someone else. She and Silas were both outside when it came into view at the lower trail. A line of wagons moving north, 8 or 10 of them, slow and deliberate on the muddy spring road. They watched from the ridge above the trail. They'll stop at the creek crossing to water the animals, Silas said. Be there an hour at least. I know. She watched the wagons. From this distance, she couldn't see faces, just shapes, people moving around the wagons. Children, she thought, someone on horseback at the front. The sounds drifted up in pieces, voices and wheels and animals, the particular music of a group of people in motion with somewhere to go. She felt something looking at it, not longing exactly. Something more complicated, a recognition, maybe, of the world she'd come from and the specific shape of what she'd left behind when she'd decided to stay. You can go down if you want, Silas said. Talk to them, see if anyone's heard of your family's wagon. She glanced at him. He was looking at the wagons with no particular expression, which she knew by now was not the same as feeling nothing. I don't want to know where they are, she said. She'd thought about this over the long winter weeks, turned it over, examined it from different angles. Her mother, Marcus, Dale, the note under the stone. I mean, I know that might seem strange, but I've been thinking about it and I don't want to spend any time or energy going in that direction. It doesn't seem strange. Does it seem like I'm avoiding something? No. He was quiet for a moment. Seems like you know what's worth your time. She looked at him. That was, she thought, the most he'd ever said about what had happened to her on this mountain without being asked, and it was enough, more than enough. They watched the wagons reach the creek crossing and stop, the way Silas had said they would. The sounds changed, the purposeful noise of a group settling temporarily, unhitching animals, moving around with specific tasks, normal human sounds. Life being lived at a different pace and temperature than the one she'd been living. She thought about her mother writing that note, trying to imagine what was going through her mind, what she'd told herself, how she'd folded the oilcloth and placed the stone over it and walked away. You had to construct a story to do something like that, a story in which the person you were leaving behind was going to be all right, would find a way, was strong enough that your leaving wasn't really abandonment, but a kind of faith. She'd spent November hating that story. By December, she'd been too busy surviving to think about it much. By January, she'd set it down almost entirely, not through forgiveness exactly, but through a shift in what she chose to carry. The note, the stone, the backward handwriting, those things belonged to her mother. The weight of what had been done was not Alara's to carry. Silas had said that on the first night, and it had taken months to fully understand it, but she understood it now. What you did lived with you. The person you did it to got to decide whether to carry it or put it down. She put it down. That afternoon, she went down to the creek crossing alone. Not because she was reconsidering. She'd already made her decision, and it sat solid in her, the way the right decisions always felt. Not comfortable necessarily, but certain, grounded, without the hollow quality of something chosen badly. She went because she'd realized, watching the wagons, that there was something she needed that was not available on the mountain and might be available among the people stopped at the creek. Seeds. The idea had come to her 2 weeks earlier when the first bare patches of ground had appeared on the south slope, and she'd stood looking at them and thought, garden. Silas had no garden. He'd never had one. The growing season at this elevation was short and unreliable. He'd explained once when she'd asked, not worth the effort. But she'd been thinking about the food situation all winter, running numbers, and the math was better with a garden than without one, even a small one, even an unreliable one. Root vegetables mostly, the hardy ones. Maybe some of the hardier greens. You had to start with seeds. She came down to the creek, and the people there looked at her with the particular look of people encountering someone who had been somewhere difficult for a long time. She could see herself in their eyes, slightly, what she must look like, leaner than she'd started, weathered in a way that November Alara had not been, wearing clothes that had been mended multiple times and boots that had been resoled by Silas's hands. She traded 2 of the rabbit pelts she'd brought down for a paper envelope of turnip seeds, a small cloth bag of carrot seed, and some dried bean pods from a woman near the third wagon who seemed to know what she was doing with plants. They talked for a few minutes, nothing deep, the brief, honest exchange of strangers who have something useful for each other. And then Alara climbed back up to the cabin. She put the seeds on the table. Silas looked at them. Garden, she said. He looked at the seeds for a moment. Ground's too rocky above the cabin. Below the cabin. The south-facing shelf where the snow comes off first. The soil down there looked workable when I checked it last week. She sat down. I know the season's short. I'm not expecting abundance. I'm expecting to improve our margins. He looked at the seeds and then at her with the expression she'd cataloged months ago and never found a perfect label for. The one that meant he was updating something. I'll help clear the rocks. I know you will. She picked up the carrot seeds. I'm going to need you to teach me what you know about growing things at elevation. That's not much. More than I know. He almost smiled. She saw it at the corner of his mouth. That almost smile she'd learned to catch in its brief window before it closed again. I'll tell you what I know, he said. That's all I'm asking. Summer came slowly and they worked hard through it. The east wall seam was worse than she'd thought. They spent 3 days in May pulling logs apart and repacking the chinking with a mixture Silas made from clay and pine pitch, and it was miserable work, dirty and slow. And she did it badly twice before she understood the technique. The roof over the storage side turned out to need 2 new support timbers, which meant felling trees, which meant learning to use the saw properly, which meant blisters she hadn't had since November. The garden produced turnips. Not many, not large, but real. Actual food from the ground that hadn't existed before she'd put seeds in it. She pulled the first one in late August and held it up, and Silas said, in the tone that meant he was revising an estimate, which was the closest he came to being impressed. And she was unreasonably pleased about it, and she didn't hide that. Don't get too attached, he said. Next year might be worse. Next year I'll know more about the soil. She turned the turnip over in her hands. I'll do better. He looked at her. You always say that. I'm always right about it. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. They were not the same people they'd been in November. That seemed obvious, and it was. But the ways it was true were specific and worth accounting for. Alara had developed a fluency in this life. The mountain, the work, the particular language of practical existence in a harsh place that had settled into her body as well as her mind. Her bad legs still hurt on cold mornings and after long runs, and it always would. But she'd learned to work with it rather than against it, to build her movement patterns around its actual capacity rather than the capacity she wished it had. That was not the same as being healed. It was something more useful than healed. Silas had learned to talk more. Not much more. He was never going to be a man who filled silence with words. But he'd stopped editing himself down to pure necessity when they were alone together in the evenings. He told her things. Small things, mostly. Something he'd seen on the mountain that day. A memory that had surfaced while he was working alone. Once, only once. Something about the life he'd had before the mountain. A woman. Gone before the mountain years. Not his loss to explain, and she didn't ask him to. He'd offered that much, and she'd taken it carefully and set it somewhere respectful. She told him things, too. About her brother Marcus, who she thought was probably a decent person who had made a bad choice under pressure and would have to figure out how to live with it. About her mother, who she'd decided was someone she might write to someday. Not to repair things, but because carrying complete silence felt heavier than carrying the occasional letter. About what she'd wanted to be before the bad leg and the bad circumstances had contracted her world down to the question of daily survival. And what she thought now about what she still wanted. "I want this," she said, one evening in September when the nights had started turning cold again, and they were sitting at the table after supper, the cards between them, neither of them having gotten around to dealing yet. "I want the mountain and the work and the trap lines. I want the garden to get better next year. I want to learn everything there is to learn about living here." She paused. "I also want more books." He looked up from the table. "I know that seems unrelated," she said. "No." He leaned back in his chair. "Next time I go down for the trade, I'll see what's available. I'll go with you." He looked at her steadily. "It's a full 2 days." "I know. I've been thinking about the route. I want to know the lower mountain terrain." She held his gaze. "I want to know all of it." He nodded once. The cards sat between them, undealt, and neither of them moved to deal them. And outside, the September dark had settled over the mountain the way dark did up here. Complete, the stars when the clouds cleared so many and so bright they looked invented. "Silas," she said. "What?" She thought about how to say it. She thought about all the things she'd learned over the winter about the economy of words, about how precision was usually more honest than volume, about how the things that most needed to be said were usually the things that could be said simply. "I was left here to die," she said, "and instead I ended up with the only life I've ever actually wanted." She looked at him across the table. "I'm not saying that lightly. I know what it cost to get here. I'm saying it because it's true, and you're the reason it's true. And I think you should know that." The fire in the stove made its sounds. The dark outside was very dark and very full. Silas Crow looked at her with his dark eyes that she knew the color of now. Brown at the center, green at the edge. She'd had a whole winter and then a summer to learn this. And he said, "You're the reason it's true." She shook her head. "We're both the reason." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the cards and he shuffled them and he dealt. And she picked up her hand and looked at it, and outside the mountain settled into its autumn self, cooling and preparing and beginning the long work of becoming winter again. She was not afraid of winter. She had learned over the length of one brutal and necessary year that fear was not the appropriate response to hard things. Attention was the appropriate response. Preparation. The willingness to do the work even when the work was painful, even when you did it badly, even when the results were a scarred thigh and a ruined pelt and a garden with 12 turnips instead of 100. You showed up, you stayed. You learned what the situation actually required rather than what you wished it required. You told the truth even when the truth was uncomfortable, and you accepted the truth when it was told to you. You did not let people carry weight that was theirs to put down. And when someone dragged you out of the snow without offering comfort or promises, without asking anything of you except that you be honest and work hard and not waste what was given, when someone like that turned out to be exactly the person you needed, at exactly the moment you needed them, in exactly the form you hadn't known to ask for, you stayed. Her hand was not particularly good. She played it anyway. Silas took the first round. She took the second. The fire burned through the night, steady and well-fed and warm, and the mountain held them both in its cold and indifferent and necessary embrace, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.